So my name is Hans De Froy. I am the virtual CIO with DKB Innovative, one of three virtual CIOs here. And in short, my job is to do IT strategy for our clients. So obviously, there's a lot of other components there, but IT strategy would be kind of how you would sum that up. And our topic for today is my IT guy handles that. And whether that's an MSP, whether that's internal IT, I've done both, but really it's interchangeable here, right? So I'll kind of be, jumping back and forth between those terms because, in the end, people ascribe a lot of, things that the IT guy might do. And so we're here kind of talk about, what that really means as far as compliance is concerned, right? So a quick background here, my journey in all of this started well over a decade ago when I was the IT guy, right? And I had to figure out HIPAA compliance, and that was my responsibility, right? I mean, I was the IT guy after all, and I didn't have any experience to know any better. So after getting over some initial inertia on the task, because I have to say I didn't really want to do it, right? I got to figure this out. So surely confirming password policy, screen locks, and ensuring people aren't emailing PHI, surely that's enough, right? Well, not so much. I'm sure everybody here realizes that by now, right? So the IT staff in the organization most likely do handle things like granting or revoking access to computer systems, enforcement of password policy, implementing and updating network hardware, multi-factor authentication, antivirus, and hopefully EDR, endpoint detection and response nowadays. Backups, business continuity through short power outages, things of that nature, internet circuit outages, whatever. Those are the things that are important for any organization, not just HIPAA covered entities. So, these are generally good ideas, right? And by the way, if you need help with some of those things, shameless plug, we do that stuff. But the thing is that that's not what I would say is the majority of HIPAA compliance. Now, obviously, the IT department, whether that's in-house or whether it's outsourced, the IT department is going to play a key role in that compliance, and they may be able to play a big part in demonstrating intent to comply, but without policy to support those and other requirements, it'd be quite a stretch to really claim that you're HIPAA compliant, right? Now, quick sidebar before we continue, no discussion of HIPAA would be complete without me saying something like intent to comply. I know Jeremy's heard me say that before. Well, what do I really mean by that? Well, the OCR, this, of course, the enforcement body that enforces HIPAA, they're not going to throw the book at you if you're trying. And it's not to say that they're not going to hold you accountable, but they're not going to fine you major, dollar amounts if you're not negligent, you're making progress. And just in general, I would say keep this in mind with any discussion around HIPAA. It can feel like a lot, but in the end, the OCR really just wants you to comply, right? And so if you're following these steps and you're attending webinars like this, you're doing these things. Most likely, if you're a Cyber Trust Alliance customer, honestly, and you're using those products, at that point, there's an intent to comply, right? So I just wanted to mention that because some of this stuff's going to sound, it's like a lot, but as long as you're on that journey, you're doing all right, right? So, all right, so back to it. If compliance isn't IT, well, then what really is it? Right? Well, it's people, policy, and process. And you've probably heard those terms before in other contexts. Maybe you thought IT was the hard part, and it really isn't. It's the policy, and it's ensuring that people are following it. People are your biggest risk. Once you set a computer to do X or not Y, it's more or less going to always be configured that way, of course, unless somebody changes it, which, of course, that's where compliance comes into play. But people, that's never ending. People come and go from the organization. That's why HIPAA compliance really cannot be set it and forget it. It's got to be a part of the way the business operates. And this is the key. No vendor or no one employee, right? Whether your IT is external or in-house or whatever, no vendor or no one employee can do that for you. It turns out you really can't just say, well, my IT guy handles that, my IT company handles that. The reality is that the vast majority of all of this really is still the covered entity's responsibility. So I'll take a quick step back in time again. Before I understood all this, at this point, and this is probably around a decade ago, I'm realizing that there's far more to this than anything I can do entirely by myself. certainly as it pertains to just configuring computers a certain way. And I remember looking for help on the policy part. Surely there's somebody who's done this before, right? Well, at the time, the only options seemed to really be either paying 20 grand for a consultant, and now it'd probably more, right? To write a policy. Like, it's the first time somebody ever wrote such a policy. That seemed pretty crazy. And this has got to be relatively standard across practices like ours. So we did try like an all-in-one employment compliance solution. And one of the things that they advertise is they include policies for something like HIPAA as well, among other things. But they thought you could just sign a set of policies and be compliant. I mean, no kidding, this person said, just take these policies and sign them and you're HIPAA compliant. And I was like, oh, okay, that's absurd. I guess it turns out it's not that universal. It's not really helpful if it doesn't take into account your company. So that really wasn't the answer either. So I've been talking about people and policy, right? And so what do I really mean by that? I mean, that's what we're all here for, right? What doesn't the IT guy do? So that's kind of, I got a nice list for us all here, some examples, right? So you might assign a compliance officer, right? I mean, I can't, as an IT guy, I can't assign a compliance officer for your organization. You've got to set somebody responsible in the company for compliance in general, IT being a part of that. And this person might be responsible for the rest of the things on the list I'm about to share with you, right? Another example, ensuring your staff takes their cybersecurity training. Well, your managed services provider like us, we could sell that to you, or your IT guy could set up, cybersecurity training for you, but you got to make sure they do it. And people are your biggest risk, right? So making sure they do it is pretty important, right? Things, simpler stuff, making sure staff doesn't leave PHI on the scanner, copier, or the fax machine. Remember, PHI is not just in the computer, right? It's on people's desks. You leave it on the copy machine, that's incidental exposure, right? Configuring your office physically to restrict access to or viewing of PHI, like locking the door, installing security badges, making sure the back door is locked, making sure monitors aren't visible from public areas. That's more of something you might largely do when you build your facility, and your IT guy is not typically, I mean, they should be, but they never are. We never get looped in until, oh yeah, you get this closet and the building's halfway built. It's like, oh, thanks for that, right? So, that's another component that, you have to consider when you're building a facility out. This is a favorite one of mine. Make your doctors stop using their Yahoo accounts, right? I mean, as an IT person, I can set up proper email accounts for people to use, but if they don't use them, I mean, I can't make people log into their email, right? You've got no way to manage the security and compliance of email accounts that you don't have any control over. And honestly, it's way more of an issue than it should be in this industry. It's crazy, right? So again, as the IT person, I can't tell anybody really what to do. It's the organization has to do that, right? So make your docs stop using their Yahoo accounts. I can't tell you how big of a one that is. Here's another really big one that has to do with physician or owner behavior. Tell your doctors to stop instructing your staff to log into computers for them, or bonus points if you're using shared logins in the office. Again, that is IT adjacent, but that's not something that the IT guy, I mean, telling the doctor what to do. Yeah, I don't think so. Here's my advice on this one, because it's kind of a tough one too. Counsel your staff that doing this puts them at risk. How can you trust an audit trail that could have been anyone? What if someone does something in that login? Now you can't prove who did that. That puts everybody involved at risk. And by the way, that's why the rules are what they say they are. Train your staff to refuse. And it's tough, right? Telling your boss no, because the doctor is a boss of yours. But that's one of those organizational things that you've got to do. And again, the IT guy just doesn't, especially if you're a managed service provider like us. I mean, we're not going to get involved in that, right? So that's a really big important one too. Here's another one: maintaining a list of authorized users to ePHI, electronic PHI systems, and EHRs, and permissions by department. And you may be thinking, well, that's an IT thing for sure, right? I'm talking about not in the PHI system. Remember, you have to decide your work roles, right? You decide who does what, and who needs access to what. How can you do an audit of whether people have the proper permissions for their job duties if those job duties and what those permissions are supposed to be aren't documented, right? And remember, when you're doing this, you got to remember the rule of least privilege to perform the job function. Staff should only have access to what they need to do their job and no more. And your IT vendor doesn't necessarily understand your EHR or your organization's work roles and exactly what they do, right? An internal IT guy might, but they're still going to be looking to management and people to, guide them on that, right? The creation and enforcement of workforce clearance procedures, like employee agreements, credit checks, pre-employment screening, and so on. Obviously, your IT guy doesn't hire, right? They're not involved in hiring. They're not HR. But why does this even matter? Well, the OCR really wants you to reduce risk by making good hires. Medical records are worth a lot of money, right? So yeah, okay, IT handles the security, but putting people in the system that aren't necessarily likely to try to steal medical records is part of it too. It's all about risk reduction, right? Managing your business associate agreements. That's another thing IT isn't going to do. You've got to ensure that your vendors are contractually obligated to protect the data you store with them. And you should do vendor assessments. Ask your vendors, do they do SRAs? Are you asking? How else would you know they're holding up your end of the deal, right? So that's not an IT item either, right? Setting the rules around disclosure in the organization. Remember, HIPAA allows for disclosure for the purposes of treatment, payment, and operations, right? That was actually one of the things that was supposed to make life easier with HIPAA. They were trying to help us out a little bit, I guess it seems. But even though those are approved disclosures, you can set policy around those things, and you should. How your organization handles and documents those disclosures. If for no other reason, consider this. You're supposed to be able to present a report of those disclosures if asked. So it's one of those things that a mature EHR and good process makes a lot more doable, but being asked that question is not a fun one if you're not ready for it, right? And how is one ready for it? Well, policy, right? Process, and so on. And to come full circle here, your IT department, they're not the people who write the policy that addresses everything I've talked about, plus what they're supposed to handle, right? So that's really the big part of this, is that policy is such a large component, like I've been talking about in all of these examples. You've got to write that for yourself, and that is really such a huge part of this. So earlier I asked, okay, well, what is the answer, right? How do we handle that non-IT part of compliance? Well, it's certainly true that today solutions like SEBA and others exist to help make this part of the process a lot easier. And they absolutely do. But regardless of which IT company you hired, or whether you have a tool to help with the policy side, only you can ensure the culture of compliance exists. And that's the big thing. Ensure the culture of compliance exists. That the organization has the policy and the procedure to be compliant, and that your docs and other leaders aren't enabling or encouraging the very opposite. And I see it all the time, right? I can do my best. I can give my best advice when I'm talking to my clients, but when the doctors aren't along for the ride and they don't understand the risk involved, there's only so much I can do, right? And so ensuring that culture of compliance, making sure that that the policy and procedure to be compliant is in place, that's the core of this. And you know what? Your IT company does not handle that, right? So, that kind of concludes kind of like what I wanted to share with everybody. I didn't want to necessarily talk for the entire time straight, because I really want to ask, be able to answer people's questions and have some conversations about it. And for the record, I'm glad to answer questions both about what your IT guy would handle, and also, of course, the kinds of things that a compliance officer would be responsible for that IT guy does not do. I mean, didn't want to have to limit it to that. So, well, thanks for your all's attention. I hope this was helpful.
That's great, Hans. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any thoughts, questions on any of that before I've got a couple thoughts of my own I'd love to share, but I want to wait first and see if anybody else has any specific questions or thoughts. Feel free to unmute and chime in. We got a small group here today.
All right, nobody wants to.
No. All right. Well, I just want to I want to jump on the bandwagon a little bit here and just kind of reinforce some of the points that you made, Hans, that I really appreciated. Right, that I think a lot of organizations tend to confuse the difference between what the IT company may or may not do versus what is their responsibility as the organization to enforce, control, and govern, right? And that kind of goes back to the intent to comply, right? If you hire an IT company that happens to provide you antivirus, and during an audit they ask you, well, what's your anti-malware policy? Well, my IT guy does that. Well, there's very marginal, if any, intent to comply there, because you're not controlling it. You're not intentionally establishing the requirements for your organization. You're trying to pass the buck, for lack of a better word. And I apologize if that comes across as harsh, but that's kind of what we see a lot, the danger of what a lot of organizations are doing these days. And what HIPAA calls for is for the organization to make some very intentional decisions controlling the security, protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of EPHI, right? And that's really what's at the root and the core of HIPAA's intent, right? To protect your patients, data, and that as the covered entity, you own that data. You're the steward on behalf of the patient to make sure that that's protected, not specifically the IT guy, right? And so that culture that you talk about and that journey, right? All of that comes full circle to, and to your point, it is a journey, right? It's not that anybody, including the OCR, expects you to be 100% nailed and comparable to the most advanced of hospitals that have, $1 million budget just in their compliance office, because they've got a compliance officer, a security officer, and a privacy officer with subordinates to run a whole team to make sure that stuff gets done. We understand, especially in the SMB space, that it's challenging. It's a conflict. It's a lot of organizations see it as a distractor, right? It's not your core competency. It's an additional requirement to operate in this industry. But it is still a requirement, right? And so the important part is the journey, the taking those incremental steps over time, showing that intention to establish, those controls and that framework and that culture. The one thing I did want to kind of point out, I don't want it to sound like I'm disagreeing with you, because I'm not. I just want to put a little bit different light on it to help some of the people that might be on the call, right? When we talk about things like policies, and it's the business's responsibility to drive those policies, it's not unusual for a business leader, compliance officer, privacy officer, or otherwise to go to the IT guy and say, hey, I need a password policy. Can you help me write a password policy?
Yes.
And the IT guy is smart. He knows passwords. He knows what constitutes good password policy, and he's going to help you draft that. But one of the things that my prior employment history that I picked up along the years is that it's important for policy to have teeth, we like to call it. And when we say policy has teeth, what we mean is, even though the IT guy writes it, the CEO or the compliance officer or somebody in the C-suite, or the board even for that matter, if you have a board, should be the one signing off on that policy, right? Implementing that policy, saying, yes, organization-wide, this is our policy. And the reason that's important is because, again, to Hans's point, the IT guy doesn't have sway over how the rest of the organization behaves and whether or not they follow his policy. There's no authority there, right? So that, and a lot of times you'll see like the security officer in a large hospital will frequently be a CISO, or some senior C-suite or executive leadership over IT, because it fits well. They know that most of your security controls exist in the IT space, and they have that authority because they're in that C-suite space. And that tends to make a little bit more sense. But in the smaller environment, it's got to split between, getting guidance, technical support, and help from that IT partner or employee, but being enforced and signed off on by that leadership component. And that's where it really starts to take the shape I think they intend for it to have.
Yeah, I have often recommended, obviously you got to start small, right? We talk about it being a journey. It doesn't have to be this big complex thing. And so a lot of times I recommend to my clients, look, you may not have all of the things, but start with something simple like maybe an IT acceptable use policy, right? Just the basics that people understand what's expected of them. And you're absolutely right. One of the things that I do indicate to them and let them know is that, first of all, make sure your HR department or whoever wears that hat in your organization looks at that and sees it and understands it, right? And then include, the things you want them to do, and also help them understand, include in the policy that states, look, if you don't do those things, the sort of the standard consequences that would be available in a work environment are a potential, outcome of non-compliance with these things, right? And it's funny, like people don't always really think to do that. It seems so straightforward when you talk about it, but it's not always obvious. And one of the things I always tell them is, hey, that cybersecurity training, right, that you guys have, make that a condition of employment, right? So that way, if they don't do it, you have some recourse. And it sounds, again, harsh. You said it might sound harsh, but I mean, in the end, it has to be something that the organization encourages, or it doesn't happen, right? I mean, if there's no checks or controls on things, people don't usually do them, right? And that's
absolutely, that's a great point.
Yeah, and that's also why that policy you said around the IT side really makes sense too. You said we could do malware, right? We could do malware protection, we could do antivirus, but what if that policy doesn't exist? Well, the thing is, why does that matter, right? Well, okay, if somebody in the organization changes, right? If management, if the organization changes, they don't necessarily know about this stuff. They're not as familiar with IT. If the organization needs to be able to survive changes like that, right? And so if there's written policy, that's to some degree sort of part of that organizational knowledge and history of the organization. If that policy doesn't exist, then is the next guy necessarily going to know to hold the IT vendor accountable for that, right? I mean, that's part of it too. Is you don't want your only knowledge about your HIPAA compliance program walking out the door when somebody takes it, their next job, right?
Absolutely. What else? Anybody? Thoughts, questions? It's a lot of really good information, Hans. We really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm glad to do it. I do enjoy talking about this, mostly not because I just love the topic per se, but because I do like helping people not to have to, I guess, go through things the hard way, I guess. And I feel like I had to do a little bit the hard way back before, but when you think about it, 10 to 15 years ago, even though these rules existed at the time, or at least some of them did, there really wasn't a huge push for that until a lot more recently. So there wasn't a lot of, help on the market, for this sort of thing. So that's why I really do enjoy, explaining this stuff and working with my clients and trying to get them there, the baby steps, and like you said, smaller organizations are not necessarily going to have the resources of a large hospital. But fortunately, the rules were written to where that can be accommodated, right? They're open-ended and they're vague, which makes things really confusing. But once you kind of understand it, it does make it doable, even for smaller organizations, because the degree to which you have to manage risk is in the end on you. And, smaller practices just have different risk profiles than the big organizations do, right? So that's the beauty of the whole thing, is that, yeah, it's confusing. And I in the beginning, I was like, oh man, why doesn't anybody just tell me what I need to do, right? But if they did that, then it would be very, very prescriptive for one type of organization, and that really wouldn't be reasonable. So yeah, okay, it seems confusing, but the way the rules were actually written, actually quite logical, so that it could apply, the full spectrum of small practice all the way up to hospital. So all of that to say, it's a little bit confusing up front, and that's a downside. But the end result is that it's very doable at all levels, as long as you're willing to put forth some effort to do it. That's the key, and that comes back to caring enough to do it, or that culture of compliance. And that's the thing, when it's missing, that's where the OCR kind of starts going hog wild with the fines.
Absolutely. No, it's a great point. I like to tell people that, a lot of times the obscurity or the open-endedness of some of the regs is really where the secret of flexibility lies. It's what
Yes.
makes it adaptable to all sizes. One of the other things I like to make sure people understand is that there's no such thing as not applicable in HIPAA, right? There's addressable versus required, right? Required's self-explanatory, but addressable doesn't mean optional. Addressable means if you feel for some reason that the standard as it's written is unreasonable, unnecessary, or unachievable for your organization, you've got to write and explain how you're addressing that risk, or how that objective is being met, not why it's not applicable, right? And so we're right at the bottom of the hour. I want to thank you, Hans, for your time today.
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to give everybody one action item. If you've got an IT guy who you think has it handled, and this conversation maybe gave you some good questions around the difference between what they're doing and maybe what you might be able as a business member help facilitate, lead, or own, or manage, start it with a conversation, right? Talk to your IT guy or your IT organization, your MSP, about what they are doing, and maybe open up that question for what they're not doing that maybe they have the ability to help guide you through. And maybe there's just conversation to be had there, right? Without the, the open-ended assumption that they might have it covered if it's not being driven by the business.
Yep, I would agree. Yeah, as Cyber Trust Alliance partners, we bring, Cyber Trust Alliance to the table to help our clients, right, with this area, right? So even though we as the IT guy don't necessarily write policy for you, we can advise you on an option to help yourself write those policies and get those things done, right? So like Jeremy said, have that conversation, and you'll find something that you can work on, guaranteed.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, everybody. Thank you so much, Hans, for your insight and your time today as well.
Yep.
Anna Rose is recording this. She'll stop the recording and make sure that that's shared out and posted and made available to go out to all the far reaches of the interwebs.